There is a route on Kilimanjaro that only the desperate take. This path has a bad reputation among local guides, and most tour operators discourage tourists from taking it. But in September 2015, a young couple from San Francisco, who sold everything for a round-the-world trip, chose this very route. What happens over the next 72 hours on the slopes of Africa's highest mountain will shock the world and make us wonder where the line between dream and recklessness lies. Scott Dinsmore was one of those people who made others believe in themselves. Tall, with an open smile and infectious enthusiasm, he had a rare gift, the ability to find the spark in strangers' eyes and fan it into a flame. In 2010, after several years working for a Fortune 500 corporation where he felt drained by routine, Scott founded the Live Your Legend movement. The idea was simple in its genius: help people find work that inspires them and live in alignment with their passions. In 5 years, the movement grew into a global community of 206 local groups in 57 countries. His TED Talk, How to Find and Pursue Your Passion, garnered millions of views, and Live Your Legend local meetings brought together thousands of people around the world. Scott believed in 3 simple principles: self-knowledge, the right environment, and action. If we don't know what we're looking for, we'll never find it, he said. But most importantly, he lived by his own words. Chelsea Dinsmore was not just Scott's wife, but his equal partner in all his endeavors. They married in 2010, united by a shared philosophy of living without regrets. While Scott inspired people from the stage, Chelsea worked on community development, planning meetings, and organizing projects. Their relationship was built on mutual support for each other's dreams, even the most daring ones. That's why in January 2015, when Scott suggested selling all their possessions and going on a trip around the world, Chelsea agreed without hesitation. 6 months on the road changed their view of the world. Croatia, Turkey, Morocco. Each country became a chapter in the book of their shared memories. They met people, listened to their stories, and photographed sunsets over unfamiliar cities. Scott kept a blog about the trip, sharing his experiences with the Live Your Legend community. "We packed our lives into backpacks," he wrote, and these words reflected the entire philosophy of their journey. By September 2015, they had reached Tanzania. Kilimanjaro had been Scott's dream since childhood. The highest peak in Africa, 1,900 feet above sea level, a dormant stratovolcano with 3 peaks and glaciers at the equator. Unlike technical climbs in the Himalayas or the Andes, Kilimanjaro does not require mountaineering experience. It is high-altitude trekking, accessible to anyone who is physically fit. Tens of thousands of tourists climb to the summit every year. But there is one but. Scott and Chelsea chose the Western Breach, a route that experienced guides call rock bowling. Instead of a gradual ascent along the well-trodden paths of the popular Meringue or Machame routes, the Western Breach leads up a steep slope through an area of unstable volcanic rock. It's a short way to the top, but it's dangerously dangerous. In 2006, a rockfall on this route killed 3 climbers, after which the authorities temporarily closed it. By 2015, the route was open again, but with warnings about the risks. Scott and Chelsea wanted to experience the silence of the high slopes and the harshness of the route. This choice was entirely in line with Scott's philosophy: not to settle for easy paths, to seek challenges, to live life to the fullest. He spent his entire life telling people to do the impossible and push the boundaries. Now it was time to apply those words to himself. On September 4th, 2015, Scott wrote in his blog, "I almost gave up on Kilimanjaro because of my fear of being disconnected from the internet, but that would have been a tragedy." He had no idea that in 72 hours his name would be known to millions of people around the world, and that their shared dream would change Chelsea's life forever. The Semblan base camp welcomed Scott and Chelsea with perfect dry season weather. A motley crew gathered at the camp: French students, a German retired couple, and an American photographer. Chelsea stood out with her energy. She photographed everything, joked with the porters in broken English, and shared her plans with her fellow travelers. Their group was accompanied by a local guide who knew Western Breach like the back of his hand. He gave a standard briefing on the risks of altitude, the importance of drinking water, and the need to stay with the group. But when the conversation turned to rock falls, his face became serious. "Western Breach is a special place," he said, looking at the route map. "The rocks here have a life of their own. We're going early in the morning when the cold keeps them in place." Scott nodded, jotting down the recommendations in his notebook. This was precisely the challenge he was looking for. The first few days of the climb were like a dream. The route led from humid rainforests to alpine wastelands at an altitude of 13,000 feet. Scott and Chelsea were in excellent shape. 6 months of travel had toughened them up physically. By the evening of the third day, they reached Lava Tower Camp, feeling ready for the final push. On September 11th, at Arrow Glacier Camp, an encounter took place that would change the course of history. A man with a camera approached their tents and introduced himself, James Balog, a National Geographic photographer. He had dozens of climbs around the world under his belt, including rescue operations in the Himalayas, where he had seen mountains claim the lives of unprepared people. His team consisted of his partner Dick Stone, who had recently completed emergency medical training, and 2 experienced climbers from Minneapolis. That evening, around the campfire, Balog told stories about glaciers and climbing in extreme cold, about moments when survival depended on the right decisions. Scott and Chelsea listened with excitement, sharing their plans for the next day. Balog watched them closely and felt a growing sense of unease. Their overconfidence, their inexperienced movements as they packed their gear, their enthusiastic talk about the Western Breach. He had seen it all before in people who underestimated the mountains. In their enthusiasm, he recognized himself 20 years ago, when he too believed that physical fitness and motivation were everything. "Tomorrow will be harder than you think," Balog said, staring into the fire. He wanted to say more, to warn them more strongly, but he didn't want to spoil their last peaceful evening. Western Breach forgives mistakes only to the lucky, and there isn't much luck in the mountains. He didn't know that in a few hours he would witness an event that would shake the climbing community around the world. The alarm clocks rang at 2:30 a.m. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees, and the air was bitterly cold. In the darkness, the climbers pulled on warm jackets and checked their headlamps. Chelsea zipped up her bright red down jacket, the same color that would become a beacon for rescue drones a few hours later. At 3:30 a.m., both groups began their ascent. Balog went first, followed by Scott and Chelsea half an hour later. The trail turned into a narrow strip among sharp rocks. Western Breach greeted them with a steep slope covered with volcanic debris. To the right was an almost vertical crater wall, and to the left was a precipice hundreds of feet deep. The first 3 hours of the climb went smoothly. At an altitude of more than 16,000 feet, the air was a third thinner, and everyone was breathing heavily, but the group moved steadily. Scott walked behind Chelsea, holding her hand on the difficult sections. They exchanged short phrases, encouraging each other. It was their moment of shared achievement. By 6 a.m., dawn was breaking. The horizon was brightening, but the sun had not yet appeared. Visibility was only a few dozen feet. Beluga's group moved ahead and disappeared into the fog. Scott and Chelsea were left alone with the mountain. At 6:20 a.m., they reached the most dangerous section. The trail ran along a narrow strip between a sheer wall and an abyss. To the left, the slope dropped away at a 70-degree angle. To the right rose piles of loose rock, the material that made Western Breach a rock bowling alley. High above them, thousands of years had turned the slope into a deadly trap. Boulders ranging in size from a fist to a car hung over the edge of the precipice, held in place only by thin layers of ice and cracks in the rock. Every gust of wind, every rise in temperature, even the vibration of footsteps, could be the final push that would release tons of rock. In this place, gravity was not a physical law, but a predator, patiently waiting for its moment. At 6:30 a.m., the silence was broken by a sharp metallic crack, the sound of rock splitting. James Balog, standing 650 feet above, instantly knew what was happening. "Take cover!" he shouted to the team, throwing himself behind the nearest boulder. High up on the crater wall, a vast mass of rock broke away from the cliff. A boulder the size of an SUV began its deadly descent. Dozens of smaller rocks followed. The cascade gained speed, turning the narrow western breach into a fatal funnel. Scott and Chelsea heard the crash a split second later. They were walking in the middle of the most dangerous section. Chelsea instinctively pressed herself against the wall. Scott turned toward the sound, raised his head and saw a black mass of rocks hurtling straight toward him. There was no time to react. From the moment of the crack to the impact, no more than 3 seconds passed. Scott only had time to raise his arm, instinctively trying to protect himself from the inevitable. The prominent boulder, traveling at about 25 miles per hour, struck him with crushing force. The blow struck his torso, instantly breaking his ribs and damaging his internal organs. The force of the impact was so great that Scott was thrown off the trail and fell several feet below. Chelsea turned at the sound of the crash and saw a nightmare. Her husband lay motionless among the rocks, his body in an unnatural position. His red jacket contrasted with the gray rocks, but there was no movement. For the first few seconds, she couldn't believe what was happening. Just a moment ago, they were walking side by side, discussing the views and making plans for the summit. Now, Scott wasn't responding to her cries. Chelsea rushed to her husband, not thinking about more rocks falling. It took several minutes to get down to where Scott was lying. She had to carefully make her way through the sharp debris. When she reached him, her heart stopped. Scott wasn't breathing. His eyes were closed and he had no pulse. Chelsea immediately began CPR. Her hands were shaking from the cold and stress, but she continued to press rhythmically on his chest, trying to restart his heart. "Scott! Wake up, Scott!" she shouted, pausing the chest compressions to give him mouth-to-mouth. The guide and porters stood nearby but did not intervene. They understood the gravity of the situation better than Chelsea. A few minutes after the rockfall, Dick Stone from the Beluga Group began to descend the slope. His recent training in emergency medicine could prove critical. The descent down the crumbling slope took about 10 minutes. Every step could trigger another rockfall, so they had to move with extreme caution. When Stone reached the scene, the picture was clear. The severity of the injuries, the unnatural position, the lack of response, everything pointed to a fatal outcome. But Chelsea continued CPR. Stone gently pulled her aside and quietly explained that there was no chance. The injuries were incompatible with life. Accepting this truth was the hardest moment of Chelsea's life. The man with whom she had shared her dreams for 5 years would never open his eyes again. The mountain that was supposed to be the triumph of their philosophy of living without regrets had become a place of tragedy. High above, Balog coordinated the rescue operation by radio. Porters from base camp were already on their way, but they would need several hours. In the meantime, Chelsea could only wait beside her husband's body. She sat on the cold rocks, unaware that in a few days the whole world would be watching her cope with the impossible. James Balog took charge of coordinating the rescue operation, knowing that the next few hours would be critical. He contacted the Lava Tower base camp, where the porters from their expedition were located, via radio. "We have an emergency at 17,000 feet, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need immediate assistance for evacuation." On the other end, Agustin Endrine, a head porter with years of mountain rescue experience, answered. Endrine instantly assessed the scale of the problem. There was no panic in his voice, only the professional focus of someone who had faced tragedy in the mountains many times before. The climb from Lava Tower took at least 3 hours up a steep slope, but he had a team of 8 experienced porters. "We're leaving immediately with stretchers," he replied, and began gathering people, knowing that every minute counted. While the porters climbed, Balog remained where he was, torn by conflicting emotions. As a photographer accustomed to documenting events, He was struck by the cruel irony of the situation. Just yesterday, he had warned of the danger. Still, he had been unable to prevent the tragedy. He was concerned not only about Chelsea, who sat next to her husband's body in silent shock, but also about the instability of the slope. Every half hour he relayed the coordinates, feeling responsible for the lives of everyone who was climbing up to help. By 10 a.m., Endringo's team reached the scene of the tragedy. 8 strong men in trekking boots carried a makeshift stretcher made of sticks and tarpaulin. Their faces showed the grim determination of people for whom mountain rescue is not a job, but a calling. They understood the risks, but they never left people on the slopes, dead or alive. Preparing for the descent took an hour and was the most painful moment for everyone present. The porters worked silently and respectfully, wrapping Scott's body in a sleeping bag. Chelsea watched their every move, as if saying goodbye to her husband for the last time. 4 porters took the stretcher, while the others secured it with ropes. Balog and Stone helped Chelsea, who moved mechanically but refused to leave the stretcher. The descent turned into a painful operation, not only technically, but also emotionally. Every 160 feet, they had to stop, and during these pauses, the silence became deafening. The porters gave commands in Swahili in hushed voices, understanding the sanctity of the moment. Their physical strength and years of experience were the only things that made the impossible possible, bringing Scott home. The descent to Lava Tower Camp took 4 agonizing hours. Chelsea walked alongside the stretcher, never leaving her husband's side. She was in a state of deep shock, answering questions in monosyllables, moving mechanically, her gaze fixed on nothing. From time to time, she reached out to touch the sleeping bag in which Scott was wrapped. Dick Stone stayed by her side, knowing that psychological support was critical at that moment. "We'll get him home," he repeated. "He'll be home." Those simple words were the only thing that could give Chelsea any comfort at that moment. A representative of the Kilimanjaro National Park Administration was waiting for them at the Lava Tower camp. The Tanzanian authorities demanded an official report on the incident to be handed over to the police. Balog gave a detailed account of the time, place, and circumstances of the rockfall. The Dinsmores guide was also questioned about the last minutes before the tragedy. Chelsea had to make the first formal decision. The body had to be taken to a hospital in Moshi for an official death certificate and to prepare documents for repatriation. She barely understood what was going on, but nodded to all the suggestions. The main thing was to get Scott home. The further descent to the park gates took another 8 hours. The porters took turns carrying the stretcher, changing every hour. By the evening of September 12th, the caravan reached the road where an ambulance was waiting for them. Scott's body was loaded into the car, and Chelsea sat next to him. The slopes of Kilimanjaro were behind them, but the most challenging part was still ahead. At Kilimanjaro Hospital in Moshi, a doctor officially pronounced him dead from blunt force trauma caused by a rock. The cause of death was apparent, and an autopsy was not required. The repatriation process began, which can take several days in Tanzania. Chelsea spent the first night after the tragedy at a hotel in Moshi, unable to sleep. She called the U.S., Scott's parents, her family, and friends from the Live Your Legend community. Every conversation was agonizing. She had to repeat the same terrible news over and over again. Her voice broke, and she couldn't form sentences. On September 14th, Chelsea flew to San Francisco alone. It was the same airport from which she and her husband had flown 8 months earlier to pursue their dream of traveling around the world. Scott's parents met her in the arrivals hall, their eyes red from crying. William Dinsmore hugged his daughter-in-law tightly and said in a trembling voice, "He lived more in his 33 years than many do in a lifetime." The family decided to remember Scott not as a victim of tragedy, but as a man who managed to fulfill his dreams. The news of the death of the founder of Live Your Legend spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, social media was filled with posts expressing grief and disbelief. The community numbered hundreds of thousands of people in 206 cities across 57 countries, and everyone felt Scott's loss as a personal tragedy. Bloggers and entrepreneurs who had been inspired by Scott posted tributes one after another. Computer screens lit up with the faces of people typing through tears about how one man had changed their lives. Thousands of comments, millions of views. The numbers grew by the hour, turning into a digital memorial to a man who taught the world to live without regret. The funeral and memorial service in San Francisco became a celebration of life rather than a mourning of death. Hundreds of people filled the hall, many coming from other states. Chelsea took the stage in the same dress she had planned to wear to welcome them home. Scott left us in one of the most beautiful places on earth, doing what he loved. We must continue his work. Within a week, a Facebook memorial group had gathered more than 4,000 members from every continent. The philosophy of living without regrets took on new meaning after the tragedy. But Chelsea would soon realize that this philosophy had a dark side that Scott had never talked about. For the first few months after returning from Tanzania, Chelsea lived in a fog. Every morning she woke up thinking Scott was there, and every morning she relived the shock of realizing it was real. Simple things: the smell of coffee he loved, the sound of notifications on her phone, the empty side of the bed, became painful reminders. Friends and psychologists advised her to give herself a year to recover, but grief doesn't follow a schedule. Chelsea signed up for mindfulness classes and started keeping an emotion journal, learning to analyze her thoughts before reacting to them. She made lists of triggers: the sight of a couple holding hands on the street, the sound of a man's laugh that sounded like Scott's, mentions of Africa in the news, even certain songs from their shared playlists. For each trigger, she came up with a coping strategy: breathing exercises, mantras, shifting her attention. The most challenging thing was the guilt. Chelsea was tormented by questions. Why did she survive, and why didn't Scott? Was it right to insist on that climb? Could she have done something differently? Her therapist helped her understand that survivor's guilt was a normal reaction, but that didn't make it any easier. 6 months later, Chelsea made a decision that surprised everyone. She would continue traveling alone. Her first trip was to Bali, where she spent a month at a yoga retreat, meditating at sunrise and crying at sunset. Then, in Vietnam, she rode a motorbike along mountain roads, feeling a mix of freedom and a sharp pain, knowing Scott couldn't see these views. Each trip was therapy, an opportunity to answer the question, who was Chelsea apart from Scott? By the end of the first year, she discovered that the Live Your Legend community needed a leader as much as she required meaning. Hundreds of letters from people Scott had inspired, meetings in 206 cities that could have fallen apart without coordination. All of it needed attention. Chelsea started small, responding to letters, coordinating local meetings, gradually realizing that continuing Scott's work was not a betrayal of his memory, but a way to stay connected to him. The first year was just survival, Chelsea later recalled. I woke up every day and asked myself, how am I going to get through another day without him? But gradually, I realized that the best way to love those around me was to be the best version of myself. And the best version of me included everything Scott had taught me. Scott's tragedy paradoxically reinforced the influence of his philosophy. The phrase, "live without regrets," took on a new meaning. Now it was backed up not only by inspiring speeches, but also by the real price that sometimes has to be paid for dreams. Scott's TED Talk continued to gain views, reaching 5 million. Chelsea regularly spoke at meetings, recounting her own journey through grief to a new life. Her story resonated with people who had lost loved ones, as well as those who were afraid to take risks for their dreams. International media covered the story as an example of how one person can influence millions of lives. Critics of the no regrets philosophy called the tragedy a natural consequence of recklessness. But such voices were few and far between. Most saw Scott's story as a reminder of the value of everyday life. By 2020, Chelsea began to feel emotionally drained. Running Live Your Legend required enormous energy, especially on her own. In 2022, she spoke candidly about her decision to focus on her own life. Right now, living without regret means having the right to be selfish, the right to focus on myself. By 2024, the Live Your Legend website had stopped updating. Scott's death did not lead to the closure of Western Breach, but it did set off a chain of changes in the mountain tourism industry. Tanzania's largest tour operators revised their safety protocols. Tusker Trails made protective helmets mandatory for Western Breach, and other operators followed suit. Photos of the tragedy and detailed explanations of the risk were included in pre-climb briefings. James Bullock became the unofficial safety ambassador for Kilimanjaro. In his interviews, he tirelessly repeated, "Western Breach is a bowling alley for rocks, where climbers play the role of pins." His articles in specialist magazines and speeches at conferences saved dozens of lives by convincing newcomers to choose safer routes such as Macham or Meringue. In climbing clubs around the world, Scott's story became a classic example of how underestimating risk can lead to tragedy. Instructors showed photos of Western Breach and talked about the importance of gradually gaining experience. "Mountains don't forgive overconfidence" became the mantra of many mountaineering schools. Paradoxically, the tragedy did not deter Live Your Legend followers from adventure. On the contrary, many saw Scott's death as a call to live more boldly, but wisely. Discussions about reasonable risks emerged in the community on how to distinguish justified courage from recklessness. People began to take preparation for expeditions more seriously, studying statistics and consulting with experienced climbers. The story of Scott and Chelsea has been included in risk psychology textbooks as an example of how charismatic leaders can unconsciously push their followers into dangerous decisions. But the main lesson was different. Dreams are worth fighting for, but wisdom lies in understanding the price you are willing to pay. Almost 10 years have passed since that morning when the metallic crash changed 2 lives forever. Today, Chelsea is an independent person with her own projects. She is a coach who helps people through crises, travels, and returns to dance. In 2025, Scott's book, edited by Chelsea, was published. It was her way of putting an end to it and letting go of the past. Scott and Chelsea's story raises the eternal question of the balance between dreams and safety. Was Scott right to choose a dangerous route for the sake of a thrilling experience? Everyone has to find their own answer. Chelsea puts it this way today: "Scott taught me to live without regrets. But now, for me, living without regrets means being honest with myself, having the right to say no to things that don't bring me joy." The rocks on Western Breach continue to fall. Climbers continue to ascend the dangerous route. Some reach the summit. Others pay the ultimate price for their dreams. The mountain remains indifferent to human tragedy. It simply is, and the choice is always ours. The story of Scott and Chelsea Dinsmore forces each of us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was Scott right to choose a dangerous path to live out his philosophy? Or was his death the price he paid for the beautiful words about living without regrets that he so inspiringly uttered on screen? Today, millions of people follow the advice of motivational speakers. Get out of your comfort zone. Risk is a noble thing. It's better to regret what you did than what you didn't do. But who is responsible when these calls lead to tragedy? Write in the comments. Are you willing to take risks for your dreams? Or has Scott's story taught you to value safety more than adventure? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, as we have many more incredible and extreme stories ahead. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episodes.